And good morning or good afternoon, wherever you might be. I'm Pete Peterson, the Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy. Welcoming you here to the seventh in our webinar series, The Quest for Community. The Quest for Community grows out of an initiative here at the Graduate Policy School called the American Project on the Future of Conservatism. And through it, we have been exploring over the course of the last 4 years a more communitarian approach to politics and policy. Today, we'll be looking at the role of philanthropy as a community building institution, understanding both its promise and perils. And I'm so excited to be joined by 4 experts and practitioners in the field. Let me introduce them in turn. Jeremy Beer has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 2 decades. Prior to co-founding American Philanthropic in 2009, he was vice president of publishing and information systems at ISI, where he also served as the editor-in-chief of the Institute's award-winning press, ISI Books. As the principal partner at American Philanthropic, Beer works closely with philanthropies and nonprofit clients in such areas as organizational strategy, board development, program analyses, and audits. Beer is the author of The Philanthropic Revolution, an alternative history of American charity, Fundraising When Times Are Bad, a guide for nonprofit leaders, and with his American Philanthropic co-founder, Jeff Kane, The Forgotten Foundations of Fundraising, Practical Advice and Contrarian Wisdom for Nonprofit Leaders. Beer is published on philanthropy, culture, and society in various academic and popular journals, including the Washington Post, the Washington Examiner, National Review, First Things, and others as you see. Alicia Manning joins us from Milwaukee. She is the Senior Program Director at the Bradley Foundation, heading up areas of giving, including welfare reform, education reform, urban renewal, youth engagement, and character formation, as well as religious freedom, marriage and family, philanthropy and nonprofit management, and the revitalization of civil society. Since joining the foundation in 1996, she has aimed to highlight the role of faith-based and private voluntary efforts in solving society's most pernicious problems. Certainly very relevant to today's conversation. Manning serves on the selection committee for the Manhattan Institute's Civil Society Award and served on a gubernatorial commission on the family. Naomi Schaefer-Riley is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, focusing on issues regarding child welfare, as well as a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. She also writes about parenting, higher education, religion, philanthropy, and culture. She is a former columnist at the New York Post and a former Wall Street Journal editor and writer, as well as the author of 6 books. Her book, Till Faith Do Us Part, How Interfaith Marriage is Transforming America, was named an editor's pick by the New York Times Book Review. Riley's writings, I'm sure many of you have seen them, appear in places like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, and City Journal. She appears regularly on Fox News and Fox Business, as well as CNBC. And finally, Bill Shambra. Bill is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Prior to joining Hudson as director of the Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal in January of 2003, Shambra was director of programs at the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee. Before joining Bradley in 1992, Shambra served as senior advisor and chief speechwriter for Attorney General Ed Meese and director of the Office of Personnel Management, Constance Horner, and secretary of the HHS, Louis Sullivan. He was also director of social policy programs at AEI and co-director of that think tank's A Decade of Study of the Constitution. From 84 to 90, Shambra served as a member of the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, to which he was appointed by President Reagan. The nonprofit Times named Shamra among its 2013 Power and Influence Top 50, lauding him, quote, for consistently sticking his finger in the eye of the sector's elite and raising questions designed to broaden the idea of philanthropy's role in America today. So a great panel. I will stop the screen share and return you all to Malibu, California, although we are spread across the country for today's conversation. The format for these Quest for Community webinars is that we're going to kick off here with a conversation among and between the panelists over the course of the next half hour or 35 minutes or so. And then we want this to be interactive. And so we welcome questions from you all through the chat feature. It would be hard to believe this would be your first time on Zoom, but if it is, there's a little Zoom icon at the bottom that says chat. Simply click on that, enter your question at any time in the conversation, and we'll get to those throughout, but we'll certainly get to those in our time towards the end. We have reserved about an hour and 10 minutes for this conversation, and so we have plenty of time to explore an important subject. This, again, is the 7th webinar in our Quest for Community series, and growing out of this American Project initiative here at the Graduate Policy School, we have been arguing for and promoting a reimagined communitarian conservatism for the 21st century. Over the course of these webinars, which began last summer, we have been looking at a variety of civic institutions and their importance during a time that is known for loneliness and alienation. How can philanthropy, in this instance, play that role as a civic institution, connecting and responding to the myriad challenges that we had before us before COVID hit? And now we're certainly seeing in new ways with the pandemic. So let's get to our panel and the conversation. Jeremy, let's begin with you. The question that I will put before each of the panelists to kind of get us started, we are going to be looking at philanthropy as a civic institution and its role in responding to very real societal challenges, but also this broader challenge of loneliness and disconnection. How's philanthropy doing as a community building institution?
I'll give you several exaggerated responses to that question, Pete, really quickly. Hopefully it'll set the stage for some conversation. And just speaking from the perspective of the elite institutions in the sector who set the tone for the sector. So certainly not speaking about all 75,000 charitable foundations in America or however many there are now, not to mention all the millions and millions of individual givers. But I would say a couple things. Building community, I'm not sure building is the verb that elite philanthropy would gravitate towards. Reforming community, reshaping communities, transforming communities, those are much more exciting and of interest to elite philanthropy than simply building community, which implies a certain passivity towards the community's own goals and not trying to reshape what those goals are and ought to be. The second thing I would say is, elite philanthropy has a different definition of community than the members of a community often have. And so that's a challenge to think through when we think about how philanthropy is doing in building community. Certainly a sort of thicker sense of community built around voluntary association and freedom of association is not as central to elite philanthropy's understanding of community as it would be for the sort of conservatives that you are involved with in this project. And then the third thing I would say, I'll go on forever, I'll just stop here, is community is far too small a scale to interest elite philanthropy, Pete. Unless we're talking about the global community, possibly the interstellar community, that might be where we are now. So if we're talking about communities in the plural, there is not just one community. There are obviously in America thousands and thousands of particular local communities. Again, I'm not sure that's even on their radar of elite philanthropy, except insofar as they believe they must conform such communities to a larger global community and its goals and aims and practices and so forth. So there's a very philosophical answer. I hope others will give but to start us out. But it's community building institution is not community building is not what philanthropy today is about at the elite level. Is what my response to that would be.
Alicia, let's come to you. You are at a philanthropy at the Bradley Foundation. Tell us a little bit about give us your thoughts on the current state of philanthropy as a community building institution.
Sure, and thanks, Pete, for the invitation to participate in this discussion. The Quest for Community is the first book that Bill Shambra assigned to me when I started working for him in 1998. So this has been a full circle moment for me. So just very quickly about the Bradley Foundation, we are a private foundation. I'm the only practicing philanthropist on this panel. And our mission is to protect constitutional order, advance the case for free markets, inform and educate citizens, and cultivate a strong civil society. It's the latter part of that we're here to talk about today. And I guess I'd like to flip the question about how are we doing, and it's reflective of what Jeremy just said, and ask the question from the other angle: what are the most pressing challenges community leaders face? Throughout America, there are credible community leaders who are revitalizing civil society right now as we speak. Most people who devote their lives to this work on our collective behalf will not be invited to pop into Zoom meetings. Or to attend conferences to lament the demise of civil society or debate about its abstractions. They are busy helping others because they're wired that way. It's not because they read a white paper that said someone should do something about civil society. They're internally driven to effectuate change by becoming mired in those particulars that Jeremy was just talking about, the particulars of the problems of the people in their communities. Effective community leaders restore communities by fostering one-to-one relationships that set the stage for personal transformation. And they provide a model to others of how to build more social connections that will serve as a trusted web of support as they overcome obstacles, stare down demons, alleviate loneliness, and not unimportantly, earn the privilege of helping others in return. And these are not problems confined to the poor, as we often portray them in philanthropy. These are the kinds of social connections we all need. In the last couple of decades, conservative communitarians have done a good job at developing a healthy understanding of the need to draw practitioners into conversations like this. And Pete, you invited several of them to pop into your previous Zooms. And conservatives broadly, of course, have rightly and vociferously objected to the intrusion of the administrative state into the lives of individuals, businesses, and private voluntary efforts. Those objections have been expanded over a period of many years into an extended critique of the destructive approaches of quasi-governmental foundations and large nonprofits that, taking their cue from government, have turned human services into a hard science. We all agree that this is bad stuff that supplants healthy communities. And community-oriented people from different points on the political spectrum had been making headway among reasonable, persuadable people in advancing the case for developing sort of devolved approaches to philanthropy until the recent intensification of identity politics poured gasoline on the fire. So I guess what I'd like to posit is that while the phenomena that are frustrating the efforts of leaders who are truly embedded in communities are many and various, with a few serious exceptions, they are not primarily attributable to the cultural crises of the last year.
Well, great table setter there, Alicia, and I definitely want to get back to that discussion around the politicization of philanthropy as one of the challenges. Naomi, let's come to you. Your thoughts on the state of the state for American philanthropy as a community building institution.
Yeah, thanks, Pete, for having me. And it's great to be on this panel with people who know a lot more about philanthropy than I do and practice it every day. I'm just an observer of the situation, And as an observer, I would say the last year or so, I kind of go back and forth between a glass half full and glass half empty feeling about where things stand. I think probably about 15 months ago, a lot of people were kind of holding their breath to see what philanthropy was going to do in the face of this crisis. Were people going to, say, oh, we're uncertain about the future, we're just going to hold on to our money and try to wait things out a little bit, or were people going to step up? And I, in the back of my mind, I had faith in the sector, and I really thought American philanthropists were going to step up, and frankly, they did in record numbers. I think we've seen that in the numbers of donations from donor advised funds, the donations to food banks, all of that really skyrocketed. And I think what was most interesting is, as you saw a lot of other institutions really failing in our country, frankly, and a lot of them governmental institutions, I think you saw the most vital community organizations supported by philanthropies really step up to help people who were in need, either because of the effects of the pandemic or frankly because of the effects of the lockdown, as we've seen now as well. So that has been kind of my glass half full feeling. I think this year really showed what the promise was of American philanthropy, and that in many ways it was fulfilled. Unfortunately, the last year has also shown us, as Alicia mentioned, a lot of this politicization. And from that, not only do I feel a glass half empty sense, both about the way that our governmental institutions are trying to interfere with those community building exercises, but I think that is also coming from a great deal of cultural pressure, which is to say, I'm not just worried about where government regulation of this sector is going. I really think that, philanthropists, and, I like the distinction Jeremy's making between elite and non-elite philanthropy. I think a lot of, for a lot of recent years, non-elite philanthropy has been able to escape a lot of the politicization. They've just kept their nose to the grindstone, really focused on their own community and building the institutions and supporting the organizations at that local level, and supporting civil society. And I think that the cultural pressure on those smaller philanthropies, those non-elite philanthropies, has been growing. And I think it's going to be very hard going forward under the current atmosphere for them to do their jobs as well as they've been doing it in the past.
Yeah, I definitely want to get to that piece. Very interesting point you make there, Naomi, about just this last year and how it's been an exemplar of both the greatness of American philanthropy, but also some of these challenges. And it seems to be on that elite, non-elite bifurcation there, which I hope we can explore in this conversation. Bill, finally to you. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to maintain the title's legitimacy to the end of this set of introductory positions here, but your view on the state of American philanthropy as a community building institution.
Very much for having me on this panel with such a distinguished group of folks. In addition to working with Alicia at one point at the Bradley Foundation, I had the honor of working with Mike Hartman and Dan Schmidt, and the three of us have now started a blog called The Giving Review, part of Jeremy's Philanthropy Daily blog, and we talk about a lot of these issues. As folks have said, by all rights, philanthropy really should be central to this project of rebuilding community in America. Americans gave almost $450 billion to charity in 2019, which should be funding all of these civic efforts that we've been talking about. But as has also been mentioned, unfortunately, philanthropy often doesn't do that. In fact, it looks at this as a waste of resources. The first large American foundations established early in the 20th century, Rockefeller and Carnegie, were determined to get beyond just making grants to everyday charities. That was just addressing symptoms as they understood it. They wanted rather to get to the root causes of problems. And solve them once and for all. So that's the source of this distinction we often hear between charity and philanthropy. At the time, the new physical and social sciences seemed to hold great promise for getting to root causes. But this demanded that power be taken away from everyday nonprofits, which were too often hopelessly mired in primitive moral and religious beliefs. And it was instead essential to concentrate and centralize power in technocratic professional elites who were trained in these sciences. It was also necessary to recruit more dollars for root cause solutions than mere philanthropy could provide. So our largest foundations dove into politics and began lobbying government to put taxpayer dollars behind their preferred solutions. And if this sounds like American progressivism, that's exactly what it is. Too many foundations don't see themselves as alternatives to massive government spending, but rather champions of it. The most and as we've also heard, the most recent version of root cause philanthropy is the effort to get beyond just giving to worthwhile nonprofits and low-income communities, but rather to try to dismantle the structural racism that we've been told is the source of our nation's woes. That's why the most prominent American foundations have contributed over $500 million, that's billion with a B, dollars, to dismantling structural racism since just last July. Now, the good news is, even if they do completely dominate the professional discourse, foundations only account for about 17% of giving in America. The 70% of giving by individuals could be available to do the right thing by refusing to be recruited into this grand root cause campaign. The people who care for the restoration of community in America really need to turn to a far more humble and concrete form of giving, directly and immediately to local charities that are doing good in their own backyards. And that can be done, by the way, without tackling massive policy changes, which can be incredibly difficult. It can be done by each of your listeners, donor by donor, right now. It can start with support for the groups that you featured in your webcast, with social innovators like Anton Lucky and Hayden Scarena and Scott Strode. I know we'll probably hear about a lot more worthwhile groups in the course of the conversation. So the potential of philanthropy for rebuilding community is immense, but it has to get over this hubristic conviction that it can solve problems once and for all, and that its main job is to recruit taxpayer dollars for their favorite causes.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, for that. I'm struck. I'm not at liberty to say who it was, but I was provided with one of our, we've just concluded the semester here at Pepperdine, and a faculty member shared part of a final exam paper written by a student that came from a pretty hard scrabble upbringing and went to a major public institution for undergrad before coming here. And there was one line in his paper in which he didn't come into this undergraduate institution with really any political leaning, maybe slightly left. It was a class on social inequality was the title of the class. And he said at one point he realized that there was going to be a problem when he realized that the goal of the class was not to help lead and encourage people out of poverty, but to eliminate poverty altogether. And this distinction between addressing issues on the one-on-one or community basis versus the elimination of the entire issue that we've labeled, whatever that might be, global warming, systemic racism, all these, poverty writ large, homelessness writ large, is certainly one that I wanted to get at here, which is the question of scale, and the importance, as we've argued here through the work of the American Project, of locally driven solutions and the benefits of returning to that scope and scale. And I want to start with you, Jeremy, and just quote back to you one of the a brief passage from a piece that you wrote in Philanthropy Daily titled Philanthropy Should Be Localist, in which you write, and I quote, "In many ways, localism would also allow us to do philanthropy well. It is easier to spot local needs, to evaluate which local organizations are most effective, and to assess the impact of your local giving, especially if you've been living in one place for a while, than it is to do any of these things with respect to national or international groups." And so back to this battle between community as a local, geographically boundaried place versus the national community, which of course has always been the quest for progressives. Your thought on the importance of philanthropy maintaining a geographic set of limits as it approaches policy issues?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't take the quite completely radical position that, sorry about that, all your giving should be local.
Yeah.
But so much of the conversations when we sit down with philanthropists or foundations is how do we assess the impact of our giving, how make it effective, more efficient, what have you, those sorts of words, business words. I hope Alicia will talk about the businessification of philanthropy. She promised us she was going to do that, so I hope that comes up.
She's ready.
And one of the answers is to shorten your horizon. You know, if you really are concerned about the effectiveness of your giving, give to what you can see. I mean, that's just a fairly become a standard sort of localist argument over the last generation or so. It also commits you more, it involves you more personally in your giving in a way that makes you more accountable to its effects, right?
Mm.
So we've all heard many stories about the Gates Foundation coming in and reshaping how a school district does. Hey, you're only going to have this many pupils per classroom, blah, 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 blah. Make 8 changes, spend a lot of money. 7 of them are horrible and they're gone. And then nobody at the Gates Foundation has to live with the effect of their little grand experiment in whatever it was, and some kind of education reform in that community. That's just morally irresponsible. I mean, it seems to me we run into an ethical problem there. So yes, the argument really is just to be ethically connected, morally committed to your giving in such a way that, because you can see it and you're living with its impact. And anybody who's really concerned about a particular community, which is the only kind of community you can truly be concerned about, not in the abstract community, but a particular community. Once you start to do this kind of giving, you will see how it impacts your giving, you know. And Alicia can speak more to this than I can because she does this in Milwaukee with the Bradley Foundation. But certainly when we're talking to philanthropists and advising them, it's shorten the horizon is a big part of what we end up advising them to do oftentimes.
I want to take another look at the importance of scale, and which is also a subject that we've taken on in some other ways through the Quest for Community series. You mentioned there, just back to that quotation, Jeremy, the ability to evaluate local organizations that are most effective and assess the impact of local giving, is the importance of allowing local organizations to address even consistently widespread policy issues, but in unique ways, right? I'm just in the midst of reading a great book called Answers Behind the Red Door. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's by Michelle Strebe, who heads up a homelessness shelter called St. John's in Sacramento. And one of the things that she's learned through that effort, as someone who was in the private sector and kind of volunteered for years and has now made the step into making this kind of her life calling vocationally as well as professionally, is that the government approach in California, which has been, and in many cities, particularly in California, which has been this housing first approach to homelessness, is not working. And what she's been able to do with St. John's is really hold to a pretty stringent set of criteria for people to be able to stay in the facility which is run up against not only the goals of other foundations who are interested in homelessness, but not that particular approach, as well as government as well, which again, as I said, if they're going to get involved, they're going to get involved under particular criteria. So the importance of this local lens as a way of providing flexibility for unique and customized approaches, even to national issues. Alicia, I wanted to draw you in on this, and I don't want to lose the call to the businessification of philanthropy, but also these challenges around expertise and how philanthropy is becoming, certainly at what I think we've now split as the elite versus the non-elite, at the elite levels, as not only being interested in particular policy issues, but also addressing them in particular ways.
Yes, I think what you're asking is related to this idea of businessification, though. So
Yeah.
if you can I make a comment about that, and then I'll answer your question?
Yeah.
The reason I think, and now you've blown my cover, businessification is what I regard as the sort of present existential threat to the kinds of community organizations we're talking about. There's a widely accepted and seemingly benign philanthropic orthodoxy that has crept to the forefront over time. And it's problematic for community leaders it's as problematic as having their fates determined by bureaucratic experts, because the misapplication of business ideas to philanthropy prevents them from doing what they're designed to do. So we can expand a little bit more on the details later.
Let's get into that now, just as far as how you see this approach to philanthropy actually precluding or weakening the philanthropy's opportunity to actually address its stated policy goals.
Sure. First, I'll preface my comments by saying that businessification is not a reference to corporate philanthropy. It really doesn't have anything to do with corporations.
Right.
What I'm talking about is business guys who get involved in small nonprofit organizations. And I really need to cover myself here by saying, on behalf of the Bradley Foundation, we are not those conservatives who are rethinking the wisdom of free markets. We are not pining for a more palatable, kinder, gentler, economically justifiable version of redistribution. We're pro-business. We're pro-business guys. We're pro-jobs that they create, problems they solve, wealth they generate, impulse to give back to communities. These are all good things. The problem is the misapplication of these ideas to community organizations. And it's an observation a small handful of us have made over time about the tendency of some donors and nonprofit board members to misinterpret what makes these community-driven organizations effective and valuable. Business people like order. They like vertical structures. They like linear activities. And by drawing first upon their experiences, sort of titans of industry, rather than their experience as humans who've loved people and lost people and had relationships and solved problems, they inadvertently, most of the time, impose these linear structures, processes, and priorities that are antithetical to the sort of organic, wildly vacillating, messy nature of real natural communities. They drive the development of program frameworks that are constructed to be frameworks for measurement. And this prevents leaders from responding to needs as they arise. And they dramatically overemphasize the importance of scalability and replicability. And they encourage and drive these changes with the authoritative edge that all funders have over their grantees. Community leaders, the reason I think it's an existential threat is because community leaders can opt out of large top-down philanthropic collaboratives that we've spent the last 2 decades worrying about. They can just opt out of that and do what they do because they're lean and mean. They don't always need a lot of cash. They can't opt out of their board chair, who's also their largest donor.
Mm.
So this thinking creeps in and it takes their eyes off of sort of the mission of doing what is the most important, which doesn't make sense to any elites. This question of local wisdom, whether you're an elite from the left or an elite coming from the right, local wisdom isn't deficient. It doesn't make sense. It's sort of the ministry of presence. It's the availability to deal with a problem that arises and the tolerance for nonlinear progression through this process of transformation. That's something that requires trust. None of those activities look like anything you can plot on a balance sheet.
You know, Alicia, you've mentioned before in another podcast, a discussion I know that you had with Jeremy just about the messiness of philanthropy. And I know that with you, Bill, I just wanted to pull this one quotation that was cited in a recent piece in Giving Review, which you mentioned before, by Michael Hartman, one of your partners in that, quoting you from Bob Woodson's book, The Triumphs of Joseph, which is such an important book in this space. But getting to this point, Michael quotes you as saying, because the critical first step in accepting that invitation into community and philanthropic involvement involves admitting that we are indeed broken, that something is seriously wrong, and that we are helpless and our lives are out of control. And so, Bill, I wanted to come to you for a second, because I think I know this is may sound squishy to some people, but there's something about this approach to philanthropy that's also a posture, a perspective on how not only we live in community, but how we respond to these very real challenges that we have just as human beings.
Sure, Pete. Thanks. Yeah, that was written. My little piece in Triumphs of Joseph was written about an experience I always have when I'm around the kinds of local groups that we've been talking about, that Alicia in particular has been talking about. I always find myself to be immensely spiritually refreshed when I'm around them. And the reason I felt that way was underlined for me by a grassroots leader, is because, you know, underneath a lot of the stuff that separates us, we are in fact neighbors and friends and community members alike. And it has not to do with our strengths and our wealth and all the good things about us. It has to do with our brokenness, you know, the places where we're weak, the places where we are deficient. And I think one of the things that is essential to the kind of grant making that we're talking about here is we've got to get over this idea that we're just fine and we have the answers to fix those people over there who are broken. I think, you know, part of our discussion, your discussion about alienation and loneliness, those aren't problems that are just experienced by folks in the inner city. Those are problems, you know, as Bob Woodson frequently points out, you know, parents in Palo Alto are desperate to figure out ways to solve the suicidal, you know, the wave of suicides among their young people. You know, this isn't something that's limited to low-income communities. We all tend to experience it. We all tend to try to cover it up. You know, we try to pretend we have solutions based in technocratic science, you know, based in sociology and psychology. But we often don't. And, you know, faith is often a part of that solution. And the groups that we're dealing with, that Alicia's talking about and that we're all talking about, are often faith-based groups, you know, and they're often exuberant faiths. You know, a lot of them are Pentecostal groups based in Pentecostal religion.
Mhm.
And it's a mode of worship that a lot of elites find, shall we say, difficult, but it is the answer, right, that they have
Mhm.
found, the unique answer they have found to their problems. And it is what local wisdom demands that we support, and those of us who are Episcopalians, we just have to get over that, that kind of austere religious conviction and understand that other people have found other answers to this.
Naomi, I want to come to you as we, before we get into some of the challenges. We've already highlighted a couple of them. This businessification that can happen in the way in which philanthropy community foundations address local issues. I want to talk about some of the other challenges here in a second, but I don't want to lose the point that you raised earlier about some of the more positive things that you've seen over this last year. You're based in New York. Obviously, that was a city and a region that's been hit very hard by the pandemic. Before we dive deeply into some of the real challenges facing philanthropy as a community building institution, what have you seen that's been positive, where you've seen philanthropy working in response to the pandemic in particular?
Um, so I would say that I'm rather than just talk about New York. I mean, a lot of the work that I've been doing lately is in the area of child welfare, and so I have a lot of contacts with different foster care, adoption, different child welfare organizations across the country.
Hmm.
And I've before the pandemic, I was visiting them all in person, and I was very impressed with what they did. But I think they really stepped up during the past year. There was definitely, a real crisis in child welfare. A lot of the kids were not being seen because they weren't in schools. And frankly, a lot of the government agencies that are supposed to be, receiving these reports and checking up on kids who are in vulnerable situations were not doing their jobs for one reason or another. So I think what you had was a lot of community organizations that were trying to do that outreach, to find the families that needed, whether it was, food, or whether, there were parents who had some substance abuse issues and needed support and couldn't get to like a support group in order to help deal with the issues of the stress that they were under. You also had a lot of foster agencies that recruit and train people, really learned the power of Zoom, and they were doing a lot of their training remotely. And so weirdly, I think, you would think that a lot of people would just sort of, again, the first inclination would be, oh, well, I'll lock myself in my house so I don't have to have contact and I don't put myself at risk. You actually had a lot more people in some places volunteering to do foster care, taking kids in. There was a real recognition that there were some people who usually do it who couldn't because of their own health risks, or even because they had other children in the house who would be at risk. And so they did this training remotely. Some people who ordinarily wouldn't have volunteered to do foster care, for instance, found that they were working from home all of a sudden. An airline pilot might now find that they had nothing else to do, for better or worse. And so they could do the kind of, community work and that kind of civil society building that that we're talking about, and that maybe they had thought about doing in the past. So, from my perspective, I think that's where you saw people stepping up the past year. Obviously, in all sorts of other ways, but that's where I've had kind of the most, I think, detailed view of the situation. And I would say that these organizations, which I'm just, so impressed with, a couple of years ago, I was at a meeting of something called the Christian Alliance for Orphans. And that brings together kind of all of these different entrepreneurs, almost, social entrepreneurs in the world of foster care. And to the point about the overemphasis on scaling up and replicability, I would say that these organizations sort of all grew from the ground up and were responding to community needs, but they were sort of meeting together to kind of find out what they could learn from one another. Not, how can I just make the same program I made in Little Rock, in Kansas City, but what can the folks in Kansas City learn from our experience? And I think that's obviously a much better way of thinking about this, if you're a philanthropy who wants to expand on the success of some of these groups.
That's very good. And again, I think that is certainly one of the evidences of expertise, is the belief that what works in Little Rock is going to work in Kansas City, and that ability to understand and tailor approaches, back to one of our earlier points about the importance of community and geographic limits in approaches to particular issues is something to really keep in mind. Naomi, I don't want to leave you, because I want to turn the page slightly and go into one of the challenges, another one of the challenges facing philanthropy as a community building institution, and that is the growing influence of ideology, both what's called a woke ideology, but also just as well the politicization of philanthropy, the near explicit efforts that philanthropy has been engaging in around political engagement. First, I want to quote back to you in a piece that you wrote with my friend Jim Pearson for City Journal, titled "Woke Foundations." You write, and I quote, "Foundation leaders and their staffs are not immune to fashionable ideologies. It would be convenient to say that they are just accommodating social trends in order to preserve their networks and social standing. But in fact, trustees are hiring these leaders specifically to bring a more woke perspective to their organizations." Tell us a little bit about what you've seen. We just talked about some of the positive things that have happened in philanthropy over the last year in response to COVID, but obviously we've also seen other challenges, particularly in this past year. What are you seeing around the challenges of the wokeification of American philanthropy?
Yeah, I think there's several sort of maybe I would say they're unwritten, except they're probably written in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. So let's just not say they're unwritten, but assumptions about what philanthropy should be doing, what counts as real philanthropy, what counts as worthwhile philanthropy. Bill mentioned this $500 million for racial justice. I mean, almost every issue of the Chronicle of Philanthropy is devoted to how can we highlight the work of groups, that are trying to, undo systemic racism, to end poverty, on the global level. And I think that, it has become this assumption that is what worthwhile philanthropy does. And so I think you get these boards that come in and say, who can make sure that we are, doing what everybody thinks we should be doing. And they're hiring, typically either out of the world of philanthropy itself, or they're hiring out of academia, where these ideas, start to pop up in the first place, typically. And so I think that there's this sort of sense of, even if that was not the original mission, the intent of the donor, or even if it doesn't, appear in our mission now, this is the most urgent crisis in America. It's funny the way we talk about how, in the midst of this pandemic, people still use the words, this is the most urgent crisis, is racial injustice. All of these people who have died and suffered these horrible consequences from this disease, that we are still able to say with a straight face, systemic racism in 2021 is still our most urgent crisis. So I think, but people have become convinced of that, and they have become convinced of the idea that if they are not putting their philanthropic power, resources behind that, throwing it toward those causes, that it's really worthless. And frankly, related to that, and we can get into this, is of course, this idea coming from government leaders and from policymakers that frankly, if you're not solving this crisis, your money is really kind of effectively public money that we should be taking and using for those purposes. So there's a whole lot of both governmental and cultural pressures toward doing this. But if you don't mind, I'll just take one more second because I do want to share this story, because I think that on the level of individual donors, who I don't think we should forget about, there's still a lot of people who are interested in figuring out how they can help their local community, but they're so overwhelmed and by these kind of national slogans and this sense of, well, what I really have to do is just put up a picture of myself with a Black Lives Matter sign, and that is going to help people. And so I actually had kind of a personal experience with this a few weeks ago. Well, actually it was last June, probably. My kids go to private school. I live in the suburbs of New York. And so it was a very, everybody on the school's PTO page felt the need to put up these Black Lives Matter signs on their pages. And I got very frustrated, and my husband warned me not to start a fight with all the other parents. And so I started writing a series of posts one night about local organizations that I thought were doing great work. Like I wrote a post about the Children's Scholarship Fund that many of you know about. I said, look, there is a real Black-white achievement gap in this country. And if you're interested in helping it, here's a way that you can make sure that Black kids get to go to, nice, good private schools the way our kids do. And I wrote a series of posts about different organizations. Many of these were like, civil society award winners. And I heard actually from Darla Ramfo, who's the head of the Children's Scholarship Fund, that night they got, several $100s worth of donations, randomly from my zip codes around me. And, it occurred to me that there are a lot of people who actually really do care about these issues. Like if we're, they're operating in good faith, but people wrote to me and they said, we had no idea, about these organizations and that we could be giving to them, what locally we could do. So, in the kind of rush to sort of say, like, I can't believe these people are just, being so, silly and superficial, I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that they're not aware of what are the civil society organizations around them that are doing this work. Anyway, that's my rant. Sorry.
No, that's a great point, Naomi. The fact that I think the pendulum could swing in the minds of some to say, well, are you saying you don't care about some of these related issues? And that's not at all the case. Poverty is real. Homelessness is real. Some of these challenges and achievement gaps and education gaps that are racially related are real. The question is how best to address them. And I think that is certainly illustrated by the story that you just told. Alicia, I saw you nodding there. And before I come to you, I just want to a quick note. We've got a good 10 or 15 minutes left here in our time, and I welcome any questions from our audience here. Again, just feel free to type those into the chat feature and I'll weave them in here. But your thoughts, Alicia, and particularly the government involvement piece.
Well, I don't know about the government involvement. It was enthusiastically nodding. I don't know if Naomi could see me, but your remarks are so on point, Naomi. And I do think we have to assume the best about most people who just have no idea how to respond in this environment. And that includes, I think, some small family foundations that are akin to individual donors that really are staffed by one person just trying to figure it all out on their own. And they take their cues from all kinds of different places, and they're not sure what to do in this environment. So we'll give some of those folks a pass. I think I want to just bring the conversation about wokeification down to the level of, again, the sort of dynamic community leaders, the community-driven efforts. I do think there are some very specific ways in which this situation affects them. I don't think They are in danger of sort of being canceled by this movement because they're already at the forefront of solving these problems. And when you spend your days sitting at the bedside of a person who's detoxing from heroin, or trying to find, mentors or surrogate parents for a foster child facing their 6th or 7th placement, you're not really concerned about some of these abstract arguments because you're, again, mired in that particular situation. So I don't think they often sort of are susceptible to some of these larger forces, but I do think there are two things that have posed about this time that have posed specific challenges to groups that do practical work. One is this idea of compelled speech. Even if they have the leaders, have a very nuanced view of, the role of race in communities and society, and the sort of roles of police, and sort of all of the ways in which those things can be complicated. They are pressured often, again, by board members who want to save face, or sort of outside partners that have a little bit more power than they do, to make statements that are probably contrary to how they want to approach the situation publicly. I've had lots of conversations with organizations that have sort of found themselves in that position and really want to be careful about it, not to equivocate, but because that's an acknowledgement of the sort of fullness of this complicated problem. I think the second way in which the situation poses specific problems for the groups that are doing practical work is the collapse of public institutions that has come in the wake of some of these pressures. Many of the people who are promoting the idea, for example, of defunding the police, do not go home to the neighborhoods in which that is going to be a huge problem. They do not go home and live in those neighborhoods. And it's the people on the sort of front lines who are working with vulnerable populations, vulnerable people, who have to contend with the withdrawal or the sort of the nullification of police and the public safety crisis that comes in the wake of that. And then we could say something similar about the sort of slow motion failure of large urban school districts too. So.
Jeremy, I want to come to you because what Alicia just raises there gets into especially the defund the police movement has implications for policy and politics more broadly. And we have seen the growing politicization of foundations, not just in this approach towards what might be called more broadly a woke ideology, but into political engagement. The so-called saving of democracy is now front and center for, again, I would offer elite foundations. Your thoughts on some of the challenges around this quest for on the part of major foundations to save democracy, and how that may call into question nonprofit status, which of course is intended to maintain the nonpartisan nature of foundations and nonprofits.
Bill should talk about this too, because he has.
Yeah, I'm coming to him next.
About it, but it is, because I'm going to steal his first point from him. He doesn't know that. It is the natural outgrowth of a root causes approach to social problems, or to conceiving of the world as full of social problems that need to be solved at their roots. Leveraging politics and getting into politics is just a way to leverage more dollars and to leverage more power towards solving the problems you've identified. Why wouldn't you do that? If the only, there's no logical restraint once you've accepted the sort of logic of philanthropy that Bill outlined in his opening remarks. And so the only restraint would be a legal one. But the line between, we were talking about this in our prep for this webinar, as you know, Pete, you can do lots of things under the banner of a 501c3 in this country, voter education being one of those things. And voter education can is not considered to be in a sort of an illegal political activity. And so the line between politics and philanthropy is a very, very blurry one indeed. I don't know. I'd like to hear what Bill thinks about this and others, maybe Naomi too, whether such a line can even be maintained. The more radical solution that I have been gravitating toward, and again, I want to know what Bill thinks about this too, is maybe this whole thing is a mistake. The cordoning off of charitable activity and foundations into special tax status, with the idea that the money going in there is serving communities and serving a common good. If that's not really what's happening, then why are we doing that? Maybe we need to rethink all of that. Maybe we need to rethink the idea of permanent endowments. Is there a reason why $1 trillion should be locked up in assets? Basically Wall Street. We're funding Wall Street with that. Okay, that's what's happening. Is there a reason $1 trillion should be locked up in assets that foundations hold in this country? This tax advantage and all that sort of thing. It's a good question. Forever, most of those are going to be permanent institutions.
Mm-hmm.
I think if philanthropy is not serving the good of communities, then it opens up a lot of possibilities for reform. And I just wanted to throw out all that radical stuff before we ended this. That was get to it.
The gauntlet has been thrown your way, Bill. In our last 10 minutes or so here, your thoughts on the growing political nature of philanthropy, its focus on so-called civic engagement, but certainly seems to be coming from a particular perspective, and this broader discussion around the nonprofit status for foundation. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. First, I want to completely dissociate myself from those radical suggestions.
I know you're not comfortable with that kind of talk, Bill. So.
I really, obviously, I indulge in that kind of talk far too much. And if you're interested in the full range of activities, there was a piece in the magazine that Jeremy's associated with, The American Conservative, by Anonymous, that discusses the full range of these kinds of reforms. I'm not quite ready to abandon the charitable tax deduction, but I am ready to ask Congress to take a look at what's going on. Back in 1969, the Tax Reform Act made it pretty clear that private foundations shouldn't be engaged in politics. I mean, that the fact that the Ford Foundation was engaged in electoral activities in Cleveland was one of the main reasons why we had the ban on that kind of, or the restriction of foundations and engagement in charity and in politics, I'm sorry. And we really haven't revisited that in any significant way since then. We've got occasionally Congress takes a look at this and rattles its saber, but nothing really happens. I would love to see Congress hold some hearings on, is the Cleveland Standard still to be our guide star in this? Should we in fact still consider philanthropy apart from politics and try to maintain that boundary? If not, fine, let Congress say, okay, it's time for foundations just to drop the pretense of charity and go into politics full time. I don't think they would do that. I think Congress would be shocked at some of the things that are going on in the philanthropy world that are called charity, but are in fact nothing but politics. But since 1969, every year, the foundations creep a little closer to the line of politics and a little farther over the line into politics. They look around, nobody says anything. And so the assumption is, oh, okay, I guess everything's cool. But that really is not the case. It's just that Congress, and more to the point, the public isn't aware of the extent to which our foundations have become politicized. So You know, I agree with Jeremy, although he's a dangerous person, and
He is.
I'll disavow any specific suggestions he comes up with. I'd love for us to have conversations about that in the conservative movement.
Well, and I wonder if one of the challenges here, as we get in the last 5 minutes, and Alicia, I want to come to you, and then close with you, Naomi, is that once again, the goal that has been set is so abstract that the questions about process and coming up against that line for political engagement become much more possible, right? The goal now, and I've seen this from several foundations, is this exact phrase, saving democracy. Democracy. Now, to me, this is like war on poverty talk, right? I mean, how do we save democracy? That is, you know, obviously, and is democracy something that can be saved? I mean, and so if that's going to set the kind of target for what we're going to be going after as a foundation or nonprofit or so forth, doesn't that almost ipso facto open the door to these practices which can easily cross the line, because our goal is so virtuous and so immeasurable that, of course, hey, you know, sorry, we got involved in that voter sign up effort, and we got involved in this, you know, particular political campaign, because the broader goal is one that I think obviously we can all agree with. We don't want democracy to die, so to speak. Alicia, I wondered your thoughts on, just again, back to the scale conversation, whether this political engagement under the umbrella of saving democracy is one that almost lends itself to these kinds of problems.
I think that if we want to save democracy, we have to save civil society. And if we want to save the culture, we have to save civil society. These are not policy questions at the end of the day. And I think, to bring it back around to the practical, if you want to know what donors can do right now, donors can view this time as a sort of wake-up call. If you're a donor who cares about rebuilding strong communities designed to help citizens navigate their lives, do stop supporting careerist bureaucrats who have no firsthand knowledge of the problems they claim to solve, and who are detached from the people on whose behalf they raise money. But please also stop commissioning managers and charging them with perfecting, commoditizing, and expanding the delivery of services. Communities are not businesses either. Find the leaders in your own community who know how to restore trust and cultivate individuals capable of self-governance. Feel free to tap into your own expertise to help them be more business-like, but listen to them and try to understand why a dynamic approach that is sensitized to the changing needs of communities and grows incrementally and slowly is the only effective and sustainable approach to addressing the problems, or the very real problems that our country face today, or that we all face.
Great points. Naomi, I want to come to you just to close us out. Your thoughts around the political engagement, the question of nonprofit status, and this broader, again, issue of abstract goals being set by foundations and nonprofits versus the very real, on the ground focus on relationship building and a sense of limits, if you will, in what our goals are, a more humble approach.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by Bill's suggestion of congressional hearings. I think they would be both kind of clarifying, but also a complete circus. I mean, I think you would have a kind of, Sheldon White House, dark money, PowerPoint presentation sort of thing. But the way that they would be clarifying, frankly, I think for a lot of people in this country, is to understand. I mean, you're right to bring up this idea of saving democracy, Because who can object to saving democracy? But when you understand the political project that is at work there, saving democracy, oh, it means, not only voter drives, it means, funding left-wing newspapers, it means all sorts of things that most of the country does not want to get on board with. But when you frame it in these terms of course, we want to, undo racism, we want to end poverty, we want to save democracy, everybody thinks those sound like terrific goals, and they don't sound like political goals maybe to ordinary ears. So I think that, we have to have this clarifying moment where we say, no, I mean, a lot of philanthropy in this country, and certainly elite philanthropy, is engaged in a very explicitly political project. And it is one of the reasons that, I would definitely entertain, Jeremy's more radical suggestions about trying to eliminate these distinctions, because I think that, conservatives are probably the only ones making them. I mean, the liberals are clearly not sticking to this, these finer lines, and I think maybe we're getting played for suckers. So.
Well, on that note, again, thank you to all of you for joining us. Jeremy, Alicia, Naomi, and Bill, thanks so much for this conversation. Thanks to all of you for registering. I know that we had many who weren't able to join us live, but registered for the link to this recording. Again, all of you who have registered for this webinar will be getting a link to the recording within the next 48 hours. We find that to be a great way to promote this conversation, to continue it and build on it. And this certainly, I think, was such an important contribution to this Quest for Community series and our broader arguments for a more communitarian approach to our policy and politics. Stay tuned for the 8th in our Quest for Community series, and more coming out of the American Project, again, based here at Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy. Thanks again for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. From Pepperdine and the School of Public Policy, thanks for joining us, and God bless.